Hello everyone, welcome back. This is the Battle of Makassar. Strait. This is the Battle of video started. Let's get into it.
Barely a month ago, the fast progress in the Japanese campaigns across the Pacific had prompted them to start what was one of their most important operations of the war, the invasion of the Dutch East Indies. As we've seen, the main objective of this operation was the island of Java, yet the invaders first needed to take several airports and major towns around it, known to the Japanese as Java's Dehor. Now the Japanese are on the verge of completing their conquest of these Dehor on Borneo, the Celebes and the Moluccas. Concurrently, the island of Java was also one of the main links of the Malay barrier, and its safety was a huge concern for the Abdicom. Seeing that it was to be in huge peril if the cities of Makassar and Banjarmasin fell to the Japanese, the Allies prepared to fight in any manner they could to keep the Malay barrier intact and accomplish their mission to protect the Dutch colony. The stage was set for a very important battle of the Pacific War. If you want to expand your territory without the fuss of a war in the Pacific, try the sponsor of this video, Established Titles. It's a project that lets you become a lord or lady by purchasing.
Don't do it. It's not real.
Following the events of the last couple of weeks, General Sakaguchi and his detachment had achieved their second milestone in the Dutch East Indies operation, the conquest of Balikpapan. While the Kume detachment was mopping up the area, he was now preparing to launch the invasion of Banjarmasin in conjunction with a naval strike force. But back on January 28th, it was finally decided that he would receive no support from the IJN, and that his main forces would be appointed to support the invasion of Java. He then formed a strong unit under Colonel Yamamoto Kyohei, built around the main strength of the 146th Regiment. The plan for this unit was to rapidly advance towards the city of Banjarmasin after going ashore at Tanagrogot, while a small element of the unit, under Captain Okamoto Yoshibumi, maneuvered along the coast in small boats to land in the southern area of the city and capture the Martapura airfield. On the night of January 30th, the Okamoto unit sailed from Balikpapan and started its advance southwards. The following morning, the Yamamoto unit also departed Balikpapan and reached Adang Bay by the night of the same day. After landing, the Yamamoto unit quickly seized the town of Tanagrogot on February 1st, but the 60 Dutch soldiers of the local garrison had burnt the town before retreating. This began the widespread native support for the invaders, and culminated with many desertions on the side of the Dutch. By February 3rd, all of the Japanese forces under Yamamoto had concentrated on Tanagrogot, finally starting their overland trek towards Banjarmasin. At this point, Japanese forces were also very close to capturing the important town of Samarinda. From Lower Jinan, Captain Montero had been tasked with delaying as much as he could the Japanese advance towards the important Samarinda II airfield. But his mission was a very difficult one, especially since he wasn't allowed to launch any counterattack. Furthermore, the Kume detachment had already captured the oil fields at Sangasanga, and the Japanese were now ready to continue their advance against the town of Samarinda. Only Montero's men stood in their way. On February 2nd though, Dutch forces discovered that another Japanese column was advancing from Balikpapan towards Mentawir, forcing Montero to move again his headquarters, this time to the town of Tengarong. But Colonel Kume was also hot on the heels of the Dutch defenders, capturing Lower Jinan and Samarinda by February 3rd, and putting much pressure on Montero's forces. From Tengarong, the Dutch soldiers would continue to offer resistance until February 8th, when the Japanese forces managed to take the town. By February 15th, though, Montero had established new defensive positions at the towns of Benoa Baroe and Kotabangoan, from where he would continue to delay the advance of the Kume detachment until early March. Although the Samarinda II airfield was an important objective of the Japanese, who wanted to secure air superiority for when they launched their invasion of Java, time would eventually tell that it was not needed, as we'll see in the future. Back to Banjarmasin, Yamamoto faced an important problem. There were no roads or bridges in the jungle-covered mountain ranges, making their advance towards Banjarmasin very difficult. Furthermore, as they clambered up steep...
They had motor vehicles and 600 bicycles because of the road being so garbage. The Japanese weren't able to use it. But look how fast they're still moving. It's like it's just continuous forced marches, which I know it's probably not. But they don't. I'm so amazed
mountains.
at them.
They also had to fend against swarms of mosquitoes, land leeches, and other insects. Yet by February 4th, the Japanese had reached the town of Moyara Aweja, successfully repulsing a small Dutch army, but failing to quickly pursue them towards Matapura. In response, the Dutch executed a scorched earth tactic, causing enormous distraction in the towns east of the Barito River. By February 7th, reinforced by 2 brigades, the defenders also tried to make a stand at Kandangan, but they ended up retreating to some more solid defensive positions at Matapura. At this point, they had destroyed most of the airfields and oil fields in the area to prevent their employment by the enemy, with the evacuation of Banjarmasin also well underway. The Okamoto unit had also captured the port of Kotabaroe on the northern end of Lauat Island on February 7th, then continuing southwards and landing on Banjarmasin the next day, trying to cut off the defenders' escape. Yet by February 9th, some Dutch forces had already left East Borneo in boats, heading west towards Kotawaringin and leaving only a small number of men at the Oulin airfield. The following morning, an advance party of the Yamamoto unit finally came out of the jungles and defeated the small Dutch resistance, capturing Matapura with the aid of the indigenous people. That same day, the Okamoto unit also arrived and captured the Oulin airfield, completing the conquest of Banjarmasin. Meanwhile, in Ambon, the Eastern Detachment continued their conquest of the island. General Ito had successfully captured the town of Ambon by February 1st, forcing the main Dutch force under Commander Capitz to surrender, and sent notes to the Australian commandos and Dutch soldiers under Lieutenant Colonel Scott to do the same. This message was lost, and the Australians fought on for 2 more days. With Ambon and the northern side of the peninsula secured, Ito then sent his main forces to defeat the stubborn Australian commandos to the south, but they could only establish a foothold on the Nona Plateau due to the strong Australian resistance. On February 2nd, SNLF Marines would launch a strong charge against the Laha airfield, but the attack made little progress and they suffered many casualties in return. In the meantime, however, a small Japanese force that had gone through the jungles into the highlands north of Laha defeated dozens of enemy troops and prepared to launch a surprise attack on the airfield.
Wow.
The following day, this attack was launched into the rear of the surprised Australians, quickly overwhelming their defences and forcing them to surrender. That same day, the main units of the Eastern Detachment captured an important highland in the centre of the Nona Plateau, getting very close to the southern tip of the peninsula and finally forcing the rest of the Australian commandos and Dutch defenders to surrender. With Ambon now firmly in Japanese hands, Ito would command mopping up operations for the next 2 days, then starting to prepare for the invasion of the island of Timor. We now take a quick detour towards the Marshall and Gilbert Islands, where 2 US carrier task forces, under the overall command of Vice Admiral William Halsey, launched aerial raids on February 1st, inflicting light to moderate damage on the island's garrisons and infrastructure, destroying 18 aircraft and sinking or damaging several enemy warships. Concurrently in the Philippines, intense fighting continued across the Orion-Bagak line, but especially at the Quinoran and Anyasan Point, Japanese and Filipino forces were in a bloody struggle for control of the coastal points. Even despite their numerical superiority, the Philippine scouts and constabulary forces were simply not strong enough to push the invaders back, and on February 1st they would face a serious threat. Trying to secure control of the Quinoran Point, General Homa sent his last reinforcements during the night, but they would fail to land at their objective due to the strong aerial assault of the 4 remaining P-40s, an intense artillery barrage, and the deadly attack of American PT boats that sunk half the Japanese force and forced them to go ashore at Canas Point. Now completely alone, the 600 Japanese soldiers at Quinorin began to slowly concede territory at high cost for the defenders. And back to the Irian Bagak line, the fierce American resistance had taken a heavy toll on the Japanese soldiers. After nearly a month of continuous fighting, the battered 16th Division and 65th Independent Mixed Brigade were discouraged and battle-weary.
It was a month of battling? Wow.
Despite this, General Nara persisted with great tenacity in his efforts to break through the eastern sector of the line. Alas, his efforts would be in vain, with each attack being repulsed by the Allied defenders. In the west, though, General Morioka fared much better, breaking through the 1st Division's jungle positions, but having his force split into 2 pockets behind enemy lines. In response, General Wainwright launched attack after attack against the Big Pocket, in which the Japanese could block north-south traffic and hinder the movement of troops westwards, but they were continually repulsed, with the invaders even expanding towards the west. Only by cutting their supply route behind them could the Americans really threaten the Big Pocket. Meanwhile, by February 5th, the Filipino forces at Quinorin had been reinforced with a tank platoon and 70 men from the 21st Pursuit Squadron under Captain William Ed Dias, successfully cornering the Japanese to a small area at the edge of the point. The airmen, led by Dias, would embark from Mariveles in 2 armoured whaleboats and gunboats on February 8th, then landing at Aglaloma Bay and decimating the remaining Japanese soldiers that had gone into hiding in some caves. With opposition at Quinorin Point terminated at last, the Allied defenders then concentrated on the remaining points that were still under the control of the invaders, finally overtaking these positions and bringing an end to 2 entire Japanese battalions by February 13th. On February 6th, Morioka prepared to launch a general offensive to re-establish a supply route with the Big Pocket, by employing a recently arrived battalion of the 33rd Regiment. Initially, the Japanese assault went really well, breaking the main line of the defenders and getting perilously close to the Big Pocket. Yet the efforts of Wainwright's men eventually paid off, and the invaders' advance was stopped. This allowed the Americans to concentrate.
I think that's the first time I've seen 2 Japanese units get defeated. I mean, I'm obviously I've seen them lose, but it's like a unicorn in these battles. It's rarely happening. Rarely.
This allowed the Americans to
Unicorns are more than rare. They don't exist. That's a terrible way for me to put that.
Concentrate on reducing these pockets, which came at a great cost for the defenders. Even despite the employment of tanks and the establishment of a cordon around the pockets, the ferocious Japanese could not be subdued. By January 9th, though, the little pocket had been abandoned, and the men fell into a trap to the west, where they were completely annihilated. With his offensive bogged down on both fronts, and the Battle of the Points lost, General Homma had no other choice but to order the withdrawal of all of his engaged forces all along the Irian Bagak line to some more secure positions. The soldiers under Nara then began to disengage and move north, while Morioka tried to support the evacuation of the men at the Big Pocket with another attack of the 33rd Regiment. By February 11th, the Japanese managed to successfully escape from the Big Pocket under heavy American pressure.
Wow.
The almost 400 soldiers would arrive back to friendly soil on the morning of February 15th, after a march of 4 days through enemy lines and thick jungle. By February 20th, the invaders had completed their withdrawal, and Homma was ashamed to request reinforcements from Tokyo. The transfer of the 4th Division was then approved, but it would take time to get it to the Philippines from Shanghai. In the meantime, the 16th Division and the 65th Independent Mixed Brigade would have time to reorganize, rest and refit, while a tight blockade would be enforced upon the Bataan Peninsula so the defenders could not escape, successfully capturing the island of Mindoro on February 26th. Nonetheless, this was a tremendous victory for the battling bastards of Bataan. Turning back to the Dutch East Indies, the staff of the Abdicom was very worried about the rapid progress of the Japanese advance through the Pacific. The main naval base of the Allied command, based at Surabaya, was within range of Japanese aircraft since the fall of Kendari, sustaining a heavy pummeling on a daily basis, and the battered naval forces of Admiral Hart were definitely outnumbered in the Pacific. Yet their bold raid on Balikpapan during the start of the battle had a very promising outcome, so Hart decided to form the Abda Striking Force, initially consisting of several American and Dutch warships, led by Dutch Rear Admiral Karel Doorman. By February 3rd, the Allied forces had gathered east of Surabaya, then preparing to sortie the following night to head through the Flores Sea towards the Makassar Strait, where they had learned that the IJN was going to carry out a landing operation. Hart's surprise attack was actually very risky, because the Allied fleet had to transit during daylight, where they could be easily discovered. Furthermore, Japanese bombers had already sighted them during one of their daily raids, so the element of surprise was already lost. During the morning of February 4th, Japanese airmen from Kendari finally pinpointed the exact location of Doorman's forces near the Kangean Islands, so Rear Admiral Sukahara Nishizo of the 11th Air Fleet launched 36 G4M and 24 G3M bombers to get them. From the get-go, the Japanese aviators went for the Allied cruisers, dropping bombs over the Marblehead and the Houston. Although the Houston skillfully evaded all bombs, the Marblehead was hit hard on the quarterdeck, suffering heavy damage. The final attacks were then launched against the Houston and the De Ruyter, with all of the bombs missing except for the last one. This scored a devastating hit over the Houston, causing severe damage on the American cruiser. By midday, Doorman realized that his forces were in great peril, so he started to retreat west back to Surabaya. The first operation of the Abda Striking Force had ended in a fiasco, but at least they hadn't suffered any sunk ships.
Yeah?
Meanwhile, with the mopping up of Ambon finally completed, the Japanese invasion fleet, commanded by Admiral Takagi, departed Kendari on February 6th, escorting the Sasebo force of SNLF Marines for the conquest of Makassar. Due to Doorman's failure at the Makassar Strait, this fleet was only hindered by a US submarine, which actually managed to sink the destroyer Natsushio. Despite this, the landings proceeded according to plan on February 9th, and soon the 1,000 Dutch soldiers of Colonel Voorman were overwhelmed and forced to retreat into the jungles. The capture of Makassar marked the fall of the Celebes, where only some small guerrilla groups continued to operate. This also left the road to Java open at last, but still there was one major objective that the Japanese wanted to capture before launching their main offensive, the key airfield of Palembang in southern Sumatra. But you'll have to wait a little bit for that, as next week we'll cover the beginning of the critical Battle of Singapore and the final conclusion of the Malaya campaign. Thanks to established titles.
Wow. That was good. I'm liking this series. I know it looks like I've only done 11, but I've actually done 20 something. They've been good though. But it's late, and I am tired, so it's bedtime for me. But until next time, like and subscribe, or you're gonna have something terrible happen to your anus when you sleep.